This notion that somehow we are headed for a dictatorship or the Nazification of the good old USA if Donald Trump is elected. Take a look at our history. Franklin Roosevelt essentially he ruled the country as a dictator. Congress was there just to rubber stamp whatever he did. Abraham Lincoln ruled the country, or what was left of it. It was split in half at the time, as a dictator. Suspended habeas corpus, which meant he could lock up anybody who he thought was a problem during the war effort without giving them a hearing. So some guys languished in cells for the duration of the war. They had no due process of law. Heck, you go back to Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson ignored the will of the Supreme Court and went about doing whatever he pleased. He threatened to kill John C. Calhoun. Said he was going to go personally lead the army down to the Carolinas and personally hang Calhoun. And yet, in the case of all of these three, Roosevelt helped save the country, fighting off the totalitarian regimes elsewhere around the world. Lincoln preserved the Union, and whether you believe that he did that in the right way or not, we are better off today because of it. I mean, I think we would all say that if the country had been split in two, we would have never been able to have the wherewithal to win World War I or World War II. And Jackson helped expand this country. Was he a raving psychotic? Sure. But the country grew, and he opened up expansion and just continued that, allowing us to become really the global behemoth we became in the last century. 9:35, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. I want to mention my friend Dr. Eric F. Jones. He's a fellow who actually uses a much more traditional method of wellness. He doesn't sit around saying you should be, chock full of pharmaceuticals. He suggests that you return to old styles of healing, the things that your grandparents and forebears knew. He's been practicing since 1993 with master's and doctoral degrees in marriage and family therapy. Dr. Eric F. Jones uses methods of alternative healing such as naturopathy, medicinal herbs, nutrition, sound waves, intellectual and cognitive self-regulation, and napathy. These help remedy and manage mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual challenges. He's currently accepting new patients, and he has evening and Saturday appointments available. His telephone number is 731-7178. And he's also available on Facebook. The page is Eric F. Jones, Ph.D., Mental Health and Wellness Therapist, and that's Eric with a C. It's 9:36. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. It's 49. So Donald Trump just comes along and says, look, you need a strong hand at the tiller because, again, we're going in the wrong direction. Everybody, I don't care what political background you come from, there are very few people out there who are surveyed who claim that everything is coming up roses in the good old United States. And when Michael Moore, who is concerned about the future, and he talks about the Rust Belt and the way things have gone over the last 30, 35 years, and Glenn Beck are in somewhat of agreement on some of these issues, then I think we understand. Hillary Clinton goes around saying, well, Trump is saying that people in the inner cities, it's terrible. No, it's not. Baloney. Her party created that situation. And now, just to get back at Trump, she says everything is hunky-dory. Really? Why all of the riots? Why are 500 people shot and killed so far this year in Chicago if everything's wonderful? It's not. Of course, media will back her up. Whoa, things aren't really as bad as Trump says. Right, just ask the dead people. They won't be able to answer. You're up next. You're on the air on KLIX.
Good morning, Bill.
Morning.
I just wanted to insert a little comment. When Bill Clinton was in an office, and I can't exactly remember what year, but there was a big article on about 900 tax returns that had been compromised at the IRS, and most of them had to do with very wealthy people in the country. And at that time, Lois Lerner was there. You suppose that might have a connection between with what's going on right now with Donald Trump?
Yeah, we have. And I thank you for the call because it brings out the point that especially over the last 8 years, 7.5, 7 3/4, you've had a government that has used the institutions of government as a cudgel against its political enemies. and somebody else has the temerity to claim that Donald Trump will install some sort of fascist regime? Hello? I mean, these people have been used to actually go after political enemies. And we see it's not just the Internal Revenue Service; it's the Environmental Protection Agency, it's the USDA. All of these organizations have been so politicized now that they see their role is to go around the country and intimidate and silence dissent. When you've got the Federal Elections Commission trying to argue that if you have any foreign ownership in media whatsoever in your company, that you can no longer make any political statements? This is America, right? Or it's supposed to be. We got about 20 minutes left in the program. Bill Colley with you on Speaking of America. Hillary Clinton has plans to send hundreds of thousands of Americans off to re-education camps. Oh, she wouldn't put it in those words. Yet Trump's called the fascist. Let me share with you what I'm talking about following the break. It's 48. Bill Colley with you at 9:40 on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We were talking about the uptick in crime in this country, I believe, in the last hour of the show? I know it's not a long show, but some days, we get into so much detail that I tend to forget which hour we talked about it. But I referenced the story in the Times News that says, well, yes, crime is up a bit in Idaho and nationwide, but it's still not near a historical high. And yet that ignores the fact that, yes, in small towns across the country, in between the left and right coast or outside the Great Lakes, where you have a lot of old Rust Belt cities, yes, crime is low and always has been, but it is high. There's a big spike in the big cities in this country. And I shared the story out of the Washington Examiner that backed that up. I have this as well today. It's 9:44. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Pat Buchanan, in a column he wrote last week, he says, celebrating the racial diversity of the Charlotte protesters last week, William Barber, chairman of the North Carolina NAACP, proudly proclaimed, "This is what democracy looks like." How is the legitimate investigation of the death of Keith Scott advanced, he writes, by a mob? And if mass civil disobedience is what democracy now looks like, why are we surprised that other nations look less and less to American democracy as their model? Yeah, that night of those initial couple of nights, stores were looted, people were beat up, cops were beat up, people were dragged from cars, somebody was killed, and yet the NAACP leader says this is what democracy looks like. It's for crying out loud, it's civil war out there, and you're calling that democracy? Truly, liberals have been smoking way too much weed. Inevitably, Buchanan writes, given the violent crime in our cities, 540 murders this year in Chicago, that was a week ago, the number's obviously higher now, and 3,000 shootings, white and black cops are going to be confronting white and black suspects. Inevitably, some of these collisions are going to result in police shooting and black deaths. Like moths to a flame, TV cameras are attracted to conflict, especially racial conflict. Networks and TV stations reward with airtime the most incendiary of racial charges. Thus, the news going out to homes and bars will continue to polarize us along racial lines. It's no different than watching when you have a high-speed chase on TV and it's covered live and these networks will pick it up. It's irrelevant to most of the news of the day, but why do they pick it up? Because people are transfixed by it. And the longer they hold your eyeballs on the screen, the more soap they can sell you. I was working at a TV station in the late 1990s, and I had a really stellar news department working for me. But one day I noticed everything had gotten quiet out in the newsroom, and I walked out of my office, and we had a bank of television monitors, about 20 of them on the wall, so you could monitor your own networks, monitor your competition, and monitor the live feeds we had coming down. We had 2 network affiliations. And we could monitor all of these feeds that were coming in. And I walked out and I turned around and I looked, and everybody was watching. There was a flatbed tractor trailer racing through the highways of Los Angeles, and it was live on television, and my staff just couldn't walk away from it. And I have to admit, it's compelling television, but it's really irrelevant to the rest of our lives. And the same thing with riots. When the riots were taking place a year and a half ago, we'll say, in Baltimore, I was able to watch that on TV, and you're transfixed because you can't walk away from it. You see stores burning, and you see people racing around in the streets because it's so incongruous to what you normally see. It's like going. Most people, I think, still go to automobile races, not necessarily see cars go round and round and round, but to spin out, roll over, and sometimes burst into flames. It's 9:48. Bill Colley with you. Our top story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. It's not going to make life easier for police officers. And yet there is one candidate for president who still believes that we have to send police officers in this country, probably hundreds of thousands of them, off to re-education camps.
They say that all of our problems would be solved simply by more law and order, as if the systemic racism plaguing our country doesn't exist. We need to fix a system where too many black parents are taken from their kids and imprisoned for minor offenses. We need to make sure our police officers are trained in de-escalating tense situations.
Yeah, can we mention that her husband was behind locking up all of these people for minor things, going back to his administration? And number two, it comes right back to it. She's still hammering away that police are a bunch of racists, and that if we could only send them off to liberal land and then we could bring them back out as, flaming liberals from re-education camps, then the whole country would be better. Oh, and by the way, they'd all vote for Democrats. Seems to me, when I hear that Donald Trump has fascist tendencies or is a totalitarian, that somebody is engaging in what the psychiatrists call projection. That is, projecting your own sinister views on other people. Listen again to what she said, especially listen to those last few words.
They say that all of our problems would be solved simply by more law and order, as if the systemic racism plaguing our country doesn't exist. We need to fix a system where too many black parents are taken from their kids and imprisoned for minor offenses. We need to make sure our police officers are trained in de-escalating tense situations.
They already are. So why the need to send them off to a special Democrat Party re-education camp? A couple of other things. I referenced this earlier. There's a story in the New York Times, of all places, today about illegal aliens creating a crime wave in a small town on Long Island. Dead bodies popping up everywhere. Corpses, if you will. Body being, if you're a Christian, a union of the soul and the body, or soul and the corpse. Excuse me. The problem is that the people like the Clinton crime family have been working to destroy us from within and without now for decades. This comes from the Washington Examiner, the great Michael Barone. And he opens with this quote: "The president believes the world will be a better place if all borders are eliminated from a trade perspective, from the viewpoint of economic development, and in welcoming people from other cultures and countries." That's a quote. The president in question, Mr. Barone writes, is Bill Clinton, speaking soon after leaving office on September 10th, 2001, in Melbourne, Australia. There's apparently no transcript. I'll go figure. The quotation is from the businessman who hosted the forum in an article in the next day's Melbourne newspaper. In other words, Bill Clinton, as long ago as 15 years, was traveling the world saying we needed to eliminate all borders and have one global government. The words, the writer says, are an interesting indicator of a general attitude of prevailing sentiment taken largely for granted, not just by Democrats and Americans like Clinton, but also by elite leaders of many parties in the advanced democracies around the world. Call it Leninism after John Lennon's lyrics in the song Imagine, where, of course, he said, "Imagine no countries." Examples A and B are the so-called comprehensive immigration legislation backed by both George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and the campaign by Prime Minister David Cameron of England to keep Britain in the European Union, both of which failed. What both ignored is that many voters think that borders and laws should mean what they say. Speaking of Brexit and what went on in England and the European Union, Nigel Farage. Gosh, I wish he was one of ours. Nigel Farage was making an appearance on the Clinton News Network over the weekend, and he says that according to what he's been witnessing, polling data doesn't show all of the potential supporters who'll be coming out on election day in favor of Donald Trump. This is the great British politician speaking, as I said just the other day.
Do you think that there are sort of hidden Trump?
Now, he's speaking, by the way, speaking with foreign men. Fareed Zakaria of CNN, who said in a column a few years ago that Americans need to stop fetishizing their Constitution. In other words, Zakaria is a totalitarian and obviously a fascist of some means. He is asking the questions of the foreigner, Nigel Farage.
Do you think that there are sort of hidden Trump voters in quite the same way? In Brexit, the polling suggested that the Remain side, the people who wanted to stay in the EU, would win. In fact, on the eve of the counting, you seemed to almost concede because you were reading all the same opinion polls we were, and yet it won. Do you think you could imagine a similar Trump surprise?
I think there are two phenomenons here. I think the first is that on telephone polls particularly, people are nervous to come across as being too conservative, too socially conservative. So, you know, we've seen in the last few years in Britain, opinion polls getting it wrong because people aren't quite telling the truth on the telephone. But there's another phenomenon here. And frankly, the polling industry in Europe, I mean, frankly, it's almost bankrupt in terms of its reputation. And I wonder whether we're seeing the same phenomenon in America. What I'm talking about is the polling companies find it really hard to find people who are outside of politics and who are now coming into politics. And that's why the opinion polls over Brexit were wrong, although I do admit I suffered myself from a bout of 11th hour nerves.
I was going to point out as well, another one of the difficulties with polling any longer, so many Americans have given up their landlines. Now, they try to wait for this, but they've given up their landlines, and if they've signed up for those do not call registries, nobody is calling them to take their opinions when it comes to polling. That's one of those vastly underreported stories that we don't hear about. Coming up on 9:55 in a couple of minutes to go today, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. 48, and on our way today to high somewhere in the lower to mid-50s. This is what liberalism, though, has done to this country. When we talk about people warning that Trump would somehow be a dictator or a fascist or a Nazi, think about what liberals have done to us. This from the Daily Caller. The Duke Men's Project for Duke University. A new 9-week program sponsored and paid for by the Duke Women's Center hopes to redefine masculinity among men at the Fancy Pants private school where a year's tuition, fees, and room and board costs $67,000. The Men's Project is novel because it provides males a space, a safe space even, in which they can discuss their own gender. It is not a re-education camp being administered by an oppressed group in the service of the feminization of American society, but rather a space by men and for women, or by women and for men, or by men and for men, or whatever they think they are this week. That's a quote, actually. Now, we're not done. Liberalism has also advanced some other notions. This also from the Daily Caller. A recent graduate of Columbia University wrote an account claiming he was reported to the school's gender-based misconduct office for calling himself handsome in a Chinese language class. Now, I took French in high school. You would often have to describe yourself, so we would always tell everybody how beautiful we were in French. Our classmates, it always got a big laugh, but apparently you can't do that any longer. Benjamin Sweetwood says he kept his dark and shameful secret, he says that jokingly, under wraps for 2 years until he could safely reveal it following his graduation. Having safely departed Columbia, he wrote an account for the Tab telling about his unexpected encounter with the gender police. A teacher sat next to me on a bench outside the classroom and told me that I made a comment in class that upset someone. Consequently, I had been reported to the gender-based misconduct office. She also told me she was not offended at all. She said she thought it was funny, but that she didn't want to get in trouble herself. You're kidding, right? I mean, this is what we've come down to in this country. How about this? The Daily Signal. Americans split evenly on requiring business owners to serve same-sex weddings. However, we've got to add 63% of weekly churchgoers, including 88% of evangelicals, said business owners should be allowed to refuse service for same-sex weddings if they had religious obligations. That's called the First Amendment. Your freedom of religion is protected, one of the 5 liberties in the First Amendment. But you see, the rest of the country doesn't know that because we've dumbed them down so much in order to corral them. So there you go again. Who is the fascist? Who is the totalitarian? How about this guy, this Joachim Noah, the basketball player, being celebrated by media and lefties across the country and fellow travelers because he went to West Point. His team, the New York Knicks, is training there. He refused to eat with the cadets because he said they're warmongers. I'm telling you, folks, we're coming apart at the seams, and it is going to require somebody with a little bit of strength to put things back together. Unfortunately, not me this week, but we've got a guy running by the name of Donald Trump. God willing, and the creek don't rise, I'll be back here tomorrow morning between 8 and 10 o'clock in the morning. Rush Limbaugh is up next on News Radio 1310 KLIX and NewsRadio1310.com.